What if the strongest man in the ring is suddenly powerless on a stretch of asphalt? What if the body that carried championship belts, stadium chants, and a nation's pride is now the subject of whispers, shaky phone footage, and headlines racing faster than facts? And what if the scariest part of this story isn't the crash itself, but what happened after? Because today, the internet didn't just wake up to news. It woke up to fear. A fatal highway crash in Nigeria. 2 lives lost. A mangled SUV. And inside that chaos, one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet, alive, dazed, shirtless, surrounded by shattered glass. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Then came the words that set everything on fire. I will not survive. Did he say it? Was it overheard? Was it fabricated? Or was it a desperate misinterpretation that spiraled out of control? Right now, millions of people think they know what happened. But knowing and understanding are not the same thing. Let's slow this moment down. Because stories like this don't unfold in straight lines. They fracture. They split. They mutate in real time. And when cameras, rumors, grief, and algorithms collide, the truth can be the first casualty. This matters, not just because of who was involved, but because of how quickly certainty replaced caution. Shortly after 11 a.m. on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway in Magong, traffic was moving the way it always does, fast, impatient, unforgiving. An SUV, later identified as carrying Anthony Joshua among its passengers, attempted an overtaking maneuver. According to early statements, speed was involved. According to later ones, the picture became more complicated. What is clear is this. The vehicle slammed into a stationary truck parked on the side of the road. Metal folded. Glass exploded. Sound vanished. 5 men were involved in total. 2 would not make it home. And almost immediately, phones were raised. Footage hit social media within minutes. Not hours. Minutes. There he was, shirtless, sitting in the wreckage. His posture slack. His face unfocused. Not screaming. Not collapsing. Just still. Too still. And that image alone became a Rorschach test for the internet. Some saw resilience. Others saw shock. Others saw something darker. Then came the second clip. Anthony Joshua seated in another vehicle, speaking to officials. Alive. Conscious. Moving. Headlines followed fast. Minor injuries. Taken to hospital. Stable. For a brief moment, the world exhaled. And then it inhaled sharply all over again. Because somewhere between those first reassuring updates and the next wave of posts, the tone shifted. Suddenly, minor injuries weren't minor anymore. Suddenly, hospital visits became critical care. Suddenly, unnamed sources began whispering that the injuries were worse than initially thought. And then the most dangerous thing of all appeared. A quote without a face. A sentence without a source. A claim without verification. I will not survive. Those words spread faster than the crash footage itself. But ask yourself this. In a moment of trauma, surrounded by responders, cameras, strangers, and chaos, who hears clearly? Who records accurately? And who benefits when fear travels faster than fact? Because here's the contradiction that sits at the heart of this story. On one side, official statements said he sustained minor injuries. On the other, viral posts insisted the situation was far more dire. Both cannot be true in the same way. So which version does the public believe? The one with paperwork, or the one with panic? This is where the story stops being just about a crash and starts becoming about narrative. Anthony Joshua is not just an athlete. He is a symbol. Strength, discipline, control. The idea that preparation can conquer chaos. That's why this moment hits harder. Because it challenges something deeper than physical safety. It challenges the illusion that strength makes you immune. And the internet doesn't like uncertainty. It fills gaps aggressively. Speculation dressed up as concern. Concern amplified into certainty. Certainty weaponized into clicks. Within hours, timelines were flooded with goodbye messages that assumed the worst had already happened. Others accused authorities of hiding the truth. Some even questioned why a man with minor injuries looked so disoriented in the footage. But here's the part most people forget. Shock doesn't look dramatic. Shock looks quiet. It looks like someone sitting down when they shouldn't be able to. It looks like delayed reactions. It looks like confusion without pain, until later. And that's where the fear found fertile ground. Because medically, shock can mask symptoms. Adrenaline can lie. People can walk away from wreckage only to deteriorate hours later. So when the internet heard minor injuries, it didn't feel reassuring. It felt incomplete. And incomplete information is dangerous, especially when two people have already died. That detail alone changed everything. Because now this wasn't just about survival. It was about guilt, about responsibility, about speed, about blame. Authorities said the SUV was believed to be traveling beyond the legally prescribed speed limit, that it lost control while overtaking, that the truck was stationary, believed to be. Those words matter. They signal investigation, not conclusion. They signal early assessment, not final truth. But online, nuance doesn't survive. What survived was fear. Fear that injuries were being downplayed. Fear that updates were delayed for optics. Fear that what people were seeing wasn't the full picture. And into that fear, the alleged quote dropped like gasoline. "I will not survive." If that sentence was never spoken, it may still haunt this story forever. Because once an idea like that takes hold, retractions don't travel as far as rumors. And right now, we're standing at the edge of two possible realities. In one, this is a tragic accident with devastating loss of life, where Anthony Joshua survives with injuries that, while serious, are not life-threatening. In the other, this is the beginning of a far darker chapter, where early reassurances crumble and the truth arrives too late. The problem? At this point in the timeline, no one watching from the outside can tell which path this story is on. And that uncertainty is exactly why this story matters now. Not tomorrow. Not after official press conferences. Now. Because what happens in the first hours after a crisis shapes everything that follows. Reputations. Trust. Public memory. And already, lines are being drawn. Between officials and influencers. Between statements and screenshots. Between what was said and what was assumed. So before we go any further, ask yourself one question. If you were sitting in that wreckage, dazed, injured, surrounded by strangers, what would you sound like? Calm, terrified, silent? And if someone misheard you or chose to reinterpret your silence, how long would it take to undo that damage? Because as this story continues, we're going to peel back the layers. The road, the crash, the footage, the quote, the contradictions. And soon, one overlooked detail will force everyone to rethink what they believe they know. But that detail didn't emerge immediately. It surfaced quietly. And when it did, it changed the entire direction of this story. Anthony Joshua. What if the most dangerous opponent that morning wasn't a man in gloves, but a stretch of road everyone thought they understood? Because highways don't announce when they're about to change your life. They don't warn you. They don't slow down for fame, strength, or preparation. They just wait. The Lagos, Ibadan Expressway has a rhythm. If you've ever driven it, you know. Long straightaways that invite speed. Sudden congestion that punishes confidence. Trucks pulled over where they shouldn't be. Cars overtaking because patience feels like weakness. That morning felt ordinary. Too ordinary. Traffic moved. Engines hummed. Drivers calculated gaps the way fighters calculate openings. Quickly, instinctively, sometimes recklessly. And inside one SUV, a group of men were doing what people always do when they think they're safe. They were talking. They were distracted. They were assuming the next minute would look like the last. That assumption would be wrong. According to early accounts, the SUV was traveling fast. Not outrageously fast, some would later argue. Just fast enough to feel in control. Just fast enough to justify an overtake. And that's the thing about overtaking on roads like this. It's a gamble that feels routine. You glance. You accelerate. You commit. Most of the time, you get away with it. This time, the road said no. Authorities would later say the vehicle was believed to be traveling beyond the legally prescribed speed limit. Believed to be. Not confirmed. Not finalized. A phrase that suggests investigation is still unfolding. But in the moment, belief didn't matter. What mattered was physics. A stationary truck was parked on the side of the road. Why it was there would become another question later. Hazard lights, warning signs, visibility, compliance. All important. All unresolved at first. The SUV drifted into its path. There was no dramatic buildup. No screech that lasted long enough to process. Just impact. Metal doesn't negotiate. Speed doesn't forgive. Momentum doesn't pause. The front of the SUV collapsed inward. Glass exploded outward. Sound compressed into a violent, disorienting silence. And in that silence, lives were altered instantly. 5 men were involved in the collision. 2 would never leave that road alive. Pause on that for a second. 2 families, somewhere, had their futures erased in the time it takes to blink. No headlines yet. No viral clips. No trending names. Just absence. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because when a globally recognized figure is involved in a tragedy, attention tilts. It doesn't mean the other lives matter less, but they are often mentioned second, or third, or briefly. That imbalance matters. It matters because it adds emotional pressure to everything that follows. Pressure on officials, pressure on witnesses, pressure on narratives, and pressure distorts truth. Now imagine the inside of that SUV in the seconds after impact. Seatbelts locked, bodies jolted, adrenaline flooding systems that haven't yet registered pain. Anthony Joshua was seated behind the driver, alongside another passenger. Not in the front, not controlling the vehicle, but close enough to feel everything. Glass rained down. The smell of metal and fuel filled the air. Time fractured. And here's where expectations betray us. People assume shock looks like screaming. Panic. Chaos. It doesn't. Shock often looks quiet. It looks like staring. It looks like slow movements. It looks like someone removing their shirt without remembering why. That's what the cameras would later capture. But before cameras, there was confusion. Who was hurt? Who wasn't moving? Who was alive? Seconds turned into minutes. Minutes stretched. Then someone did what people always do now. They pulled out a phone. And that single decision changed how the world would experience this crash. Because once a moment is filmed, it stops being private. It stops being human. It becomes content. Footage shows Anthony Joshua sitting amid shattered glass. Shirtless. Dazed. Not collapsed. Not standing tall either. Just present. To some viewers, that image screamed survival. Proof that he was okay. To others, it screamed something else. Disorientation. Concussion. Shock. And here's the contradiction that would fuel everything that followed. If he was only minimally injured, why did he look like that? It's a fair question, but it's also a dangerous one when asked without context. Because trauma doesn't follow scripts. Shortly after, another clip appeared. He's in the front seat of a different vehicle, speaking to officials. Moving. Communicating. Alive. Again, reassurance. And again, doubt. Because while one part of the internet saw stability, another saw fragility. And both groups were projecting. Now let's talk about what didn't make it into the first wave of posts. The security detail. Another vehicle had been following behind the SUV. That matters, because it means there were immediate witnesses who were not random passersby. People trained to observe, to respond. It also means there were multiple perspectives from the very beginning. And when multiple perspectives exist, stories diverge. Some would later say the speed was excessive. Others would argue it was typical for that road. Some questioned why the truck was stationary. Others focused solely on the overtake. Notice how quickly responsibility becomes a tug of war. And notice how little room there is for uncertainty. Authorities issued initial statements carefully, believed to have understood that. Investigations ongoing. But online, care reads like concealment. Silence reads like guilt. Delay reads like deception. And into that environment, speculation thrives. Because people don't like waiting. They want to know immediately. How bad is it? Is he really okay? Are we being told the truth? Those questions intensified when reports confirmed that 2 men had died. That single fact elevated everything. Because now the crash wasn't just an accident involving a celebrity. It was a fatal incident. And fatalities change tone. They raise stakes. They invite scrutiny. They turn curiosity into urgency. Suddenly, every detail mattered more. The speed, the maneuver, the truck, the seating positions, and especially the injuries. Official updates said he sustained minor injuries and was taken to hospital. Minor, a word that feels reassuring until you remember its relative. Minor compared to what? Minor compared to death? Minor compared to paralysis? Minor compared to internal injuries that haven't declared themselves yet? That ambiguity was gasoline on an already burning fire. Because within hours, posts began circulating that contradicted the official line. Anonymous claims, unverified messages, sources close to the situation. And then, like a match dropped into dry grass, the alleged quote appeared. "I will not survive." Let's be clear about something. At this point in the timeline, no verified source had attached those words to Anthony Joshua directly. No audio, no video, no named witness. Just repetition. And repetition is powerful. Say something enough times, and it starts to feel true. But ask yourself this. In the immediate aftermath of a crash, surrounded by responders, officials, strangers, and cameras, who records exact phrasing? Who distinguishes between despair, pain, shock, and literal prognosis? And more importantly, who benefits when fear escalates? Because that sentence didn't just spread concern. It reshaped the narrative. Suddenly, this wasn't about recovery. It was about farewell. Goodbye messages flooded timelines. Speculative threads exploded. People began writing emotional tributes to a man who, according to official statements, was alive and conscious. That disconnect is jarring and dangerous, because once the public imagines an ending, they resist corrections. So here we are. A road that invites speed. A maneuver that went wrong. A stationary truck. 5 men involved. 2 lives lost. One global figure at the center of a storm he didn't create. And layered over all of it, conflicting versions of reality. This chapter isn't about blame. Not yet. It's about understanding how quickly normal turns catastrophic, how routine becomes irreversible, and how a single road, on a single morning, can expose the fragile gap between strength and vulnerability. Because the most unsettling part of this story isn't the impact. It's what happened next. The pauses, the gaps, the silence between updates. And in that silence, one small detail, initially overlooked, began to surface. A detail that would force people to reconsider whether this was just an accident or the beginning of something far more complicated. What actually happens in the split second when control disappears? Because everyone talks about the crash. Very few talk about the moment before it. That fraction of time when instinct realizes something is wrong, but physics has already taken over. That's where this story turns. The SUV didn't drift slowly. It didn't hesitate politely. It moved the way fast objects do when momentum decides the outcome. Overtaking is a language drivers think they speak fluently. You glance. You judge distance. You assume the road ahead will cooperate. And when it doesn't, there is no rewind button. Witnesses would later disagree on the exact sequence. Some said the SUV accelerated sharply. Others said traffic forced a sudden decision. A few insisted the truck appeared out of nowhere. All of them were right in one way. Because perspective collapses during impact. The stationary truck wasn't moving, but in that moment, it might as well have been charging forward. That's how speed rewires perception. Objects rush at you even when they're standing still. There's a misconception that crashes are loud in a cinematic way. They're not. They're violent and abrupt. A sound like the world being folded. Metal compressing inward. Glass bursting outward. Seatbelts snapping tight against chests. Inside the SUV, bodies were thrown forward and sideways in patterns determined by angles and inertia, not intention. Anthony Joshua wasn't bracing for a punch. There was no guard up, no preparation, just sudden force. And this is where the image people saw later becomes important. He was shirtless. Why does that matter? Because it tells us something about the moments after impact. In shock, people often strip layers without realizing it. Heat spikes. Breathing becomes shallow. The body tries to regulate chaos by shedding constraints. It's not defiance. It's physiology. But to the internet, it looked symbolic. Vulnerability. Exposure. A champion stripped of armor. The front of the SUV absorbed the worst of the collision, but shockwaves don't respect seating charts. Force ripples through frames. Rear passengers aren't spared, they're redistributed. That matters when people later ask, why did he look like that if injuries were minor? Because injury severity isn't always visible. And visible distress isn't always permanent damage. 2 men didn't survive the impact. Let that sink in again. Whatever happened inside that vehicle wasn't mild. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't inconsequential. And that fact alone complicates the narrative of minor injuries. Not because it proves something darker, but because it demands humility. When lives are lost, certainty should slow down, not speed up. Emergency response. The uncomfortable answer is this. Because human bodies aren't equal. Position matters. Angle matters. Milliseconds matter. Survival doesn't distribute evenly. That truth is hard to accept, so people search for alternative explanations. Hidden injuries, delayed complications, suppressed information. And the longer official updates took, the louder speculation became. Let's pause here and ask a direct question. If you saw a video of someone sitting silently in wreckage, would you assume they were okay or not? Most people say not. That's bias. We expect drama from danger. When we don't see it, we invent it. An invention filled the gaps between the crash and the next confirmed update. Another important detail began circulating quietly. The SUV's speed wasn't just mentioned, it was emphasized. Beyond the legally prescribed limit. Those words carry legal weight, but they also carry emotional weight. They imply recklessness. They invite judgment. They demand accountability. And once accountability enters the conversation, sympathy becomes conditional. People stop asking, "How is he?" and start asking, "What did he do?" That shift changes how every injury report is read. Minor injuries? That sounds too convenient. Worse than thought. That feels more satisfying. Because fear often feels more honest than reassurance. This is the moment where the story stops being linear. From here on, it branches. One branch follows official investigation timelines, medical assessments, and verified updates. The other follows social media momentum, anonymous posts, and emotional inference. And those two branches don't move at the same speed. The official one is slow, careful, boring. The viral one is fast, loud, addictive. Guess which one most people followed? Within hours, edits of the crash footage appeared, zoomed in, slowed down, narrated with ominous music. Each edit added intention where there was none. This wasn't analysis. It was storytelling. And stories don't require proof. They require belief. But there's something else about the impact that hasn't been fully addressed yet. The moment immediately after. Because survival isn't just about walking away. It's about what happens when the adrenaline fades. Concussions don't announce themselves. Internal injuries don't trend on video. Shock wears disguises. That's why early assessments change. That's why minor injuries can later be reclassified. And that possibility, even if it never materializes, was enough to keep fear alive. So here's where we stand at the end of this chapter. A violent impact. 2 fatalities. 1 globally known survivor. Conflicting interpretations of the same footage. A word, minor, that refuses to sit comfortably beside death. And somewhere between the wreckage and the hospital, a version of events was forming that would soon challenge everything people thought they knew. Because the impact didn't end on the highway. It followed him. Into the vehicle. Into the hospital. Into the silence that came next. And it was inside that silence that a new set of questions began to surface. Questions that had nothing to do with speed or metal, and everything to do with what doctors saw once the cameras were gone. What if the most dangerous part of this entire story wasn't the crash, but the footage? Because metal stops moving eventually. Roads fall quiet. Sirens fade. But videos? Videos don't rest. They loop. They zoom. They mutate. And once they're out there, they stop belonging to the people inside them. The first clip appeared less than an hour after the crash. No watermark at first. No context. No explanation. Just chaos. Shattered glass glittering like ice. Bent metal framing a scene that felt unreal. And in the center of it all, a familiar figure sitting still, shirtless, eyes unfocused. That was it. 10 seconds. Maybe less. And yet those few seconds would do more to shape public belief than any official statement that followed. Because the human brain is wired to trust what it sees, even when it shouldn't. Let's break down what that clip actually showed. Not what people thought it showed. Not what captions claimed. What was visible. Anthony Joshua is seated inside the wrecked SUV. He's upright. He's conscious. He's not screaming. He's not talking. He looks blank. To some viewers, that meant calm. To others, it meant shock. To others, it meant something worse. And that's where interpretation stepped in. The comments filled instantly. He doesn't look okay. That's brain damage. No way he survives that. They're hiding the truth. But here's the contradiction nobody wanted to sit with. If someone is unconscious, they don't sit upright like that. If someone is dying, they don't usually appear that composed. But shock lives in the middle. Shock looks unimpressive on camera. It looks like absence. and absence terrifies people more than blood ever could. Within minutes, the clip was reposted with dramatic captions, emojis, alarmist language, music layered underneath. The same 10 seconds, reframed 100 different ways. And each repost stripped away more context. Who filmed it? When exactly was it filmed? What happened before and after? Those questions didn't trend. Fear did. Then came the second clip. Different angle. Different vehicle. Anthony Joshua in the front passenger seat, speaking to officials. His posture straighter. His expression more engaged. This clip should have balanced the first one. Instead, it complicated things. Because now people asked a new question. If he's fine enough to talk, why did he look so lost earlier? Again, a reasonable question. But reasonable questions become unreasonable conclusions when they're rushed. No one mentioned the time gap between the clips. No one clarified how shock can ebb and flow. No one explained that adrenaline wears off in waves. They just compared still frames. And comparisons are dangerous without timelines. The first clip went viral because it felt raw, unfiltered, accidental. The second felt official. And the internet doesn't trust official-looking things anymore. So it chose the first. Then something else happened. The clip started changing. Zoom-ins highlighted his eyes. Slow motion exaggerated stillness. Freeze frames were paired with ominous text. This is not shock. This is fatal injury. This is a man saying goodbye. Notice how certainty grew without new information. That's the power of repetition. And then the alleged quote entered the frame. I will not survive. Suddenly, people weren't just watching the clip. They were hearing it, even though no audio existed. Even though no lips were clearly moving. Even though no source confirmed it. The brain filled in the blanks. And once you believe you've heard something, you can't unhear it. This is where the story crossed a line. Because now, the video wasn't evidence anymore. It was prophecy. Tribute videos appeared using the same clip. Slow piano music. Faded colors. Past highlights of his career spliced with the wreckage. Think about that. A living man was being mourned in real time. And when official updates failed to keep pace with that emotional momentum, suspicion grew. Why aren't they addressing the video? Why aren't they denying the quote directly? Why is it so quiet? Silence became proof of something sinister. But here's the part most people don't consider. Medical teams don't narrate trauma in real time. Families don't issue statements while waiting for scans. Authorities don't correct every rumor instantly. Caution looks like avoidance when fear is loud. And fear was deafening. Radio stations discussed the clip without verifying it. Influencers broke down body language like forensic experts. Armchair doctors diagnosed concussions through phone screens. Everyone became an authority, and authority diluted truth. Another version of the clip surfaced hours later, cropped differently. Lower quality, but with a caption claiming it was earlier than the others. No proof, no timestamp, but it spread anyway, because earlier footage implies worse injury. And worse injury keeps people watching. The algorithm doesn't reward accuracy. It rewards engagement. And engagement was skyrocketing. Now ask yourself this. If you were Anthony Joshua's family, watching this unfold from a distance, how would it feel? Seeing your loved one dissected frame by frame. Seeing strangers argue about his survival. Seeing farewell posts while he's still breathing. That emotional toll doesn't show up in headlines. But it matters. It matters because it pressures responses. It matters because it changes how and when information is released. And that pressure fed the next contradiction. Official reports continued to say he sustained minor injuries and was taken to hospital. But the footage told a different emotional story. So people trusted the footage, even though footage shows moments, not outcomes. This is where misunderstanding of trauma becomes dangerous. Shock can make someone appear detached. Concussions can temporarily affect awareness. Adrenaline can suppress pain and emotion. None of that equals not surviving. But nuance doesn't go viral. Drama does. Then something subtle happened. People started noticing what wasn't in the clip. No blood. No visible deformity. No frantic medical intervention. Those details should have reassured viewers. Instead, they fueled another theory. They cut the video early. They're hiding the worst part. Why stop filming then? As if continuous filming is a moral obligation. As if privacy doesn't exist in emergencies. Every absence became evidence. And once that mindset takes hold, no update is enough. The second clip, him speaking to officials, was reframed as staged, controlled, sanitized. This is damage control, people said. Damage control for what? No one could answer that. But suspicion doesn't need answers. It just needs momentum. At this point, the story was no longer moving forward. It was spiraling. Old interviews were dug up, past injuries re-examined, his fighting style analyzed for signs of long-term damage. Anything to support the idea that this moment was inevitable, because humans like patterns, and tragedy feels more satisfying when it fits a narrative. But reality doesn't owe us symmetry. Reality is messy, incomplete, slow, and that slowness was killing trust. Then, late into the cycle, a small detail surfaced that most people missed. The first clip's timestamp. It didn't match the posted time. It suggested the footage had been taken earlier than assumed, or later. The metadata was inconsistent. That raised a new question. What order did these moments actually occur in? Because if the dazed clip came before emergency assessment, it means little. If it came after, it might mean more. But without clarity, people filled the gap with imagination. And imagination leaned dark. By now, the phrase worse than thought had attached itself to the story permanently, even as no medical report confirmed it, even as no official contradicted earlier statements. Language had shifted, and once language shifts, perception follows. This chapter isn't about debunking the clip. It's about understanding how quickly evidence becomes entertainment, how a man becomes a symbol, how a few seconds can outweigh hours of professional assessment. Because the viral clip didn't just document the aftermath of a crash. It rewrote it, and as it continued to spread, it began influencing something far more consequential than public opinion. It began influencing expectations. Doctors would soon face those expectations. Officials would soon face those expectations. And any update that didn't match the fear people had already absorbed would be treated with suspicion. That's the trap of virality. It sets the emotional ceiling too high. And when reality doesn't reach it, people assume reality is lying. The footage did something else too. It shifted focus away from the two men who lost their lives. Their names didn't trend. Their stories didn't loop. The camera chose one face. The internet followed. And that imbalance added moral weight to every subsequent update. Now, everything had to be dramatic enough to justify the attention. And if it wasn't, drama would be invented. As we end this chapter, remember this. The clip didn't tell us what happened. It told us what people felt. And feelings are powerful, but they're not facts. Because behind the scenes, while videos looped and captions screamed, something else was happening. Doctors were running tests. Officials were compiling reports. And a medical reality, far less cinematic than the internet imagined, was beginning to form. But when that reality emerged, it would collide head-on with the story the footage had already written. And that collision would spark the next wave of outrage. What if the most dangerous word in this entire story isn't crash or death, but minor? Because minor sounds comforting. It sounds finished. It sounds like permission to move on. And in a story where two people didn't survive, minor lands like a contradiction people refuse to accept. This is where the narrative truly split. On one side, official language. On the other, emotional reality. And they did not agree. The first statements were careful, measured, almost boring by design. Anthony Joshua sustained minor injuries. He was conscious. He was taken to hospital for evaluation. No panic. No dramatics. No prophecy. Just procedure. But procedure doesn't trend. Fear does. So the moment minor injuries hit the timeline, it was challenged, not with evidence, but with instinct. Because people had seen the footage. Because two men had died. Because the wreckage looked unforgiving. And because deep down, many people believe bad scenes must produce bad outcomes. Anything less feels dishonest. So almost immediately, a counter-narrative emerged. Injuries worse than thought. Notice how clever that phrase is. It doesn't say fatal. It doesn't say critical. It doesn't say stable. It floats. Just ominous enough to keep people watching. Just vague enough to avoid being disproven. Worse than thought compared to what? Whose thought? At what moment? Those questions didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling it created. Suspicion. The internet began to interrogate the word minor like it was a suspect. Minor head injury? Minor internal injury? Minor compared to what happened to the others? And here's where misunderstanding medicine becomes dangerous. Emergency medicine speaks in categories. The public speaks in emotion. Minor in clinical terms can mean non-life-threatening at that moment. It does not mean painless. It does not mean insignificant. It does not mean no risk. But to people watching from their phones, minor felt like minimization, like something was being swept aside. And once that idea took hold, every delay became suspicious. Why hasn't the hospital released details? Why no scans mentioned? Why no timeline? But hospitals don't update Twitter. They treat patients. They run imaging. They observe neurological responses. They wait. Waiting is not hiding. But online, waiting feels like avoidance. And the longer it went on, the more the phrase, worse than thought, gained traction. It appeared in captions, in thumbnails, in whispered voiceovers. Never sourced, never confirmed, but repeated. And repetition does something dangerous. It upgrades speculation into belief. Now let's talk about the contradiction everyone avoided. If injuries were truly catastrophic, why was he speaking to officials? Why was he conscious? Why was he not rushed away in visible distress? Those questions threatened the darker narrative, so they were reframed. He's in shock. Adrenaline is masking it. They don't want people to panic. All possible, none proven. But possibility is enough when fear is already lit. Here's another detail that quietly fueled suspicion. The phrase, taken to hospital, doesn't specify which one. It doesn't specify how. It doesn't specify urgency. Ambiguity breeds imagination. Was it a nearby clinic? A trauma center? Was he transferred later? Each unanswered question became a thread people pulled on, and the media ecosystem rewarded whoever pulled hardest. The irony is this. If officials had said nothing, outrage would have erupted. When they said something restrained, outrage still erupted. Because the public wasn't waiting for information. It was waiting for validation of fear. Now consider the context again. 2 men died at the scene. That fact alone makes it emotionally difficult to accept that someone else could walk away with relatively less harm. But survival is uneven, and the human brain hates that. We want symmetry, justice, balance. When tragedy feels lopsided, we assume something is missing. So people went looking for what was missing. They dissected his past fights. They referenced previous knockdowns. They speculated about accumulated trauma. Anything to support the idea that this crash had to be worse than officials were saying. And then there was the alleged quote, "I will not survive." That sentence didn't just challenge the injury assessment. It nuked it. Because if those words were true, if they were spoken sincerely, then everything else was a lie. So the story became binary. Either the quote was fake, or the updates were. There was no middle ground. And nuance died there. But let's slow down and examine that quote in this context. Who would hear it? In what condition? At what moment? A man in shock may say something despairing. A witness may paraphrase emotion into certainty. A listener may retell it with added weight. Trauma compresses language, but the internet expanded it. Suddenly, that single sentence outweighed doctors, officials, and visible reality, because it fit the mood. And mood is powerful. Here's another uncomfortable truth. In crises involving famous people, there is often an unspoken expectation of drama. Audiences don't consciously want harm, but they expect stakes. Minor injuries feel anticlimactic next to fatal wreckage and viral footage. So the phrase, worse than thought, filled the gap between expectation and reality. It made the story feel proportional again. That doesn't make it true. It makes it satisfying. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, medicine was doing what it always does. Checking pupils, running scans, monitoring vitals, waiting to see what unfolds after adrenaline fades. This process doesn't produce instant headlines. It produces cautious conclusions. And cautious conclusions don't survive in an environment addicted to immediacy. Another contradiction surfaced quietly. Some early posts claimed critical condition. Later posts walked that back. Then others doubled down. The story couldn't decide what it wanted to be, so it became everything at once. Minor injuries. Worse than thought. Critical, but stable. Stable, but concerning. A fog of language. And fog is where fear thrives. People began accusing officials of protecting an image, of downplaying injuries to avoid panic, of managing optics instead of truth. But here's the question no one wanted to answer. Protecting whose image? Anthony Joshua's? The sports? The country's? Conspiracy needs motive. And no clear motive ever emerged. Just distrust. Distrust amplified by years of misinformation cycles. Distrust amplified by social media's memory of past cover-ups in unrelated cases. People projected old betrayals onto a new story, and that projection reshaped how minor injuries was received. Now let's talk about timing. Medical updates often come in stages. Initial assessment, observation period, follow-up findings. But absence of worsening is not news. So silence doesn't mean escalation. It means stability. Yet stability doesn't satisfy fear. So fear invented movement. This is where headlines began playing games. Doctors monitoring closely became doctors concerned. Under observation became condition unclear. Minor injuries became worse than thought. A question mark can change everything because it invites speculation without responsibility. And those question marks multiplied. Meanwhile, supporters were split. Some urged calm. Others demanded transparency. Some accused calm voices of denial. Emotion polarized the audience. And polarization demands sides. You were either believing the official story or seeing through the lies. No room for patience. No room for waiting. No room for the possibility that the truth was exactly as unexciting as it sounded. Here's something else that fueled doubt. The phrase, taken to hospital, was never followed immediately by released. That gap allowed imaginations to run wild. Because in viral culture, release equals recovery. Observation equals danger. But observation is routine after trauma, especially when head injury is possible, especially when shock is involved, especially when the patient is high profile and caution is paramount. But again, routine doesn't trend. Suspicion does. And as this chapter closes, the divide had hardened. On one side, official language insisting there was no immediate life-threatening concern. On the other, a growing belief that the truth was being softened, delayed, or hidden. And neither side had enough information to fully convince the other. That stalemate is unstable, because something always breaks it. A leak, a statement, a revision, and the next shift in this story wouldn't come from footage or speculation. It would come from a single update that people weren't expecting. An update that didn't confirm the worst, but didn't silence the fear either. And when that update arrived, it reframed the entire argument, not by answering questions, but by creating a new one no one was ready for. What if 4 words, unverified, unattributed, and untethered to context, could outweigh every fact on record? Because that's exactly what happened. I will not survive. Those words didn't arrive with a timestamp. They didn't arrive with audio. They didn't arrive with a face willing to stand behind them. They arrived the way rumors always do. Fully formed, emotionally charged, and perfectly designed to spread. By the time most people first saw that sentence, it wasn't presented as a question. It was presented as a revelation. A final message. A confession whispered from the edge. And once that framing took hold, everything before it was rewritten. Minor injuries, recast as a lie. Hospital observation, recast as concealment. Silence, recast as confirmation. The quote didn't just challenge the official story. It replaced it. But let's rewind to the moment that sentence entered the bloodstream of the internet. The earliest versions appeared buried in comment threads. No headlines yet. Just users claiming to have heard something. Someone knew someone. Someone saw a post that got deleted. Someone's cousin worked near the scene. Classic rumor architecture. Then came the screenshots. Text-only posts. No metadata, no source, no corroboration. Just the sentence, sometimes in quotes, sometimes paraphrased, sometimes embellished. I don't think I'll survive. He said he won't make it. He knows it's over. Each version slightly different. Each repetition adding certainty instead of clarity. And here's the first red flag most people missed. The wording wasn't consistent. In real quotes, wording tends to stabilize as repetition increases. This one didn't. It morphed. That's a sign of storytelling, not reporting. But in the emotional climate surrounding a fatal crash, no one wanted to analyze structure. They wanted meaning. And meaning was supplied instantly. That quote became the emotional anchor for everything people were feeling but couldn't verify. Fear, shock, disbelief. It felt real because it felt right. Now ask yourself this. If someone actually said those words at the scene of a crash, who would hear them clearly? A bystander in panic? A responder shouting instructions? A passenger in shock? Trauma scenes are loud, chaotic, Disorienting. Words don't travel cleanly there. They fragment. They echo. They're misheard. And even if something like that was said, out of fear, pain, or confusion, does that make it a medical prognosis? Of course not. But the internet treated it as one. That's where the damage happened. Because once that quote took center stage, it changed the burden of proof. Now officials had to disprove something they had never confirmed. Doctors had to counter a sentence they never heard. Silence was no longer neutral. It was suspicious. People began demanding direct denials. Why hasn't anyone addressed the quote? Why aren't they saying it's fake? Why are they avoiding it? But responding to every rumor legitimizes it. And not responding allows it to metastasize. That's the trap. And the quote kept spreading. It jumped from comments to captions. From captions to thumbnails. From thumbnails to voiceovers. Soon, creators were saying it aloud as if it were fact. Not allegedly. Not reportedly. Just stated. And repetition did what repetition always does. It carved grooves in belief. Another uncomfortable truth surfaced at this stage. The quote fit too well. It fit the footage. It fit the fatalities. It fit the audience's expectation of gravity. So people wanted it to be true. Not consciously, not cruelly, but narratively. Because stories crave coherence. And "I will not survive" gave the story a spine. It transformed uncertainty into inevitability. And once inevitability enters a story, corrections feel like denial. Now let's examine what didn't happen. No emergency worker came forward to confirm hearing those words. No official report referenced such a statement. No audio surfaced. No video matched lip movement to sound. Nothing tangible. Yet belief grew. Because belief doesn't require evidence when emotion is already convinced. Here's where contradictions multiplied. If someone truly believed they would not survive, why were they speaking calmly to officials later? Why was there no visible distress matching that despair? Why did medical assessments not reflect a life-threatening condition? Those questions threatened the quote's authority. So the narrative adjusted. He said it earlier. He said it quietly. He didn't want cameras to hear. Each adjustment preserved the quote by making it untestable. And untestable claims are immune to refutation. At this point, the quote began influencing behavior. People flooded comment sections demanding prayers. Others accused skeptics of cruelty. Some attacked anyone repeating official statements. Belief hardened into identity. You either respected the truth, or you were complicit in hiding it. That polarization is dangerous, because it shuts down inquiry. Now let's talk about how the quote intersected with timing. The phrase emerged before any detailed medical update. That's crucial. It filled a vacuum, and vacuums pull in the loudest voices. Had a detailed update arrived immediately, the quote might have died quietly. But it didn't. So the quote became the update. And every subsequent statement was measured against it. Not against facts. Against fear. Even neutral language was reinterpreted. Under observation became touch and go. Stable became temporarily stable. No further comment became gag order. The quote reframed language. And once language is reframed, perception follows. There's another layer to this. The quote personalized the tragedy. It put words in his mouth. It turned a medical situation into a farewell monologue. And farewells are powerful. They trigger grief responses. They invite closure. They make people feel included in an intimate moment. That intimacy is intoxicating. And it's why people clung to the sentence even when it lacked proof. Because letting go of it felt like letting go of emotional connection. Now consider the ethical weight of that. A man recovering in a hospital bed, monitored, scanned, observed, became the subject of a global death watch fueled by a sentence he may never have spoken. That pressure doesn't disappear when facts emerge. It lingers. It reshapes expectations. Doctors aren't just treating a patient anymore. They're treating a narrative. And narratives don't heal easily. At this point in the story, something subtle but important happened. Official voices began choosing words more carefully, not because the situation worsened, but because expectations had. Any reassurance that didn't acknowledge fear risked backlash. So language slowed. Statements shortened. Updates spaced out, which only fed suspicion further. Because fear interprets caution as concealment. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Could the quote have been invented entirely? Yes. Could it have been a misinterpretation of something else? Also yes. Could it have been spoken in despair, without clinical meaning? Absolutely. But here's the key point. None of those possibilities justify treating it as fact. Yet that's exactly what happened. And once that line was crossed, the story stopped being about what happened. It became about what people believed happened. And belief is stubborn. By the time some outlets began questioning the quote's origin, it was too late. The sentence had already done its work. It had set emotional stakes. It had framed updates. It had polarized audiences. And even if it were later disproven, the correction would never reach as far as the rumor. That's the asymmetry of misinformation. Falsehood sprint. Truth jogs. As we close this chapter, understand this. The quote didn't ignite fear because it was verified. It ignited fear because it was believable, because it matched the mood, because it fit the images, because it satisfied narrative hunger. But belief built on emotion is unstable. And soon, that instability would collide with something concrete. Not a quote, not a clip, a medical detail, a single, clinical observation that didn't align with the story people had already accepted. And when that detail surfaced, it didn't calm the storm. It intensified it. Because it forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable possibility. That the most viral part of this story might never have been true at all. What actually happens after the cameras stop rolling? Because while the internet was arguing about quotes and clips, another world was operating quietly, methodically, and without hashtags. A world where drama is a liability, where speculation is noise, where decisions are made in minutes that don't care about public opinion. Emergency response doesn't look the way movies teach us to expect. There are no speeches, no dramatic countdowns, no instant clarity. There is protocol, and protocol doesn't rush just because people are watching. The moment first responders reached the scene, priorities were brutally simple. Who is alive? Who is conscious? Who needs immediate intervention? Not who is famous, not who will trend, just triage. And triage is uncomfortable to witness because it's cold by necessity. Two men were already beyond help. That reality collapses everything else into a second tier. Not because it matters less, but because there are only so many hands, so many minutes, so much oxygen. This is where public perception and medical reality diverge sharply. From the outside, people saw a man sitting quietly in wreckage and assumed neglect. From the inside, responders saw someone conscious, responsive, and stable enough to wait while attention went elsewhere. That's not cruelty. That's survival math. Emergency medicine works by eliminating the worst-case scenarios first. Airway, breathing, circulation. If those are intact, the patient waits, even if they're shaken, even if they're famous. And that waiting often looks like indifference to observers. It isn't. It's prioritization. Now let's talk about shock again, because it keeps getting misunderstood. Shock doesn't always mean collapse. It doesn't always mean screaming. Sometimes it means quiet compliance. A patient in shock may answer questions slowly. They may appear detached. They may follow instructions without protest. That behavior reads as calm on camera. It reads as concerning to professionals. So responders watch closely. They don't panic publicly. They don't speculate aloud. They don't announce fears. They assess. And assessment takes time. Here's another detail that matters more than people realize. There were multiple responders on scene. Official emergency services, security personnel, bystanders. Each group saw a slightly different version of events. Each group would later remember things differently. That's not deception. That's human memory under stress. So when people later claim someone heard something, that claim is filtered through chaos. Now consider transport. Anthony Joshua was moved from the wreckage into another vehicle before being taken to hospital. That detail became a conspiracy seed online. Why not an ambulance? Why move him first? What are they hiding? But in many locations, especially on busy highways, clearing the immediate danger zone comes first. Fuel leaks, traffic risk, secondary collisions. Moving someone out of harm's way doesn't mean their condition is being downplayed. It means the scene itself is dangerous. Yet online, that nuance vanished because it didn't fit the suspicion narrative. Inside emergency response, another principle applies. You don't make definitive statements at the scene. Not about prognosis, not about survival, not about outcomes. You stabilize, then reassess. So if someone later claims a responder said he won't survive, that raises questions. Because professionals are trained not to say that, especially at a scene. Could a bystander have said it? Could someone have expressed fear? Could despair have been paraphrased as certainty? All possible. But that's not the same as a medical conclusion. And yet, the internet treated it as one. Another uncomfortable truth. High-profile patients complicate response, not because they get special treatment, but because they attract attention. Cameras distract. Crowds form. Information leaks. Responders become more guarded, not less. They say less, not more. And that silence gets misread as secrecy. Now let's move to the hospital phase. Being taken to hospital doesn't mean one thing. It means many things. Observation, imaging, monitoring. Especially after a high-impact collision, even patients who appear stable are watched closely. Head injuries can be subtle. Internal injuries can be delayed. Symptoms can evolve. So doctors wait. They don't declare victory early. That caution is what people online interpreted as fear. But in medicine, caution is competence. Another factor people overlooked. Anthony Joshua is a large, highly conditioned athlete. That changes assessment. Vital signs differ. Pain tolerance differs. Physiological responses differ. What looks alarming in one body may look different in another. That doesn't mean risk is ignored. It means context is applied. But context doesn't translate well into viral language. So instead, the absence of dramatic updates became suspicious. Why no hourly bulletin? Why no press conference? Why no photo from the hospital? Because hospitals are not studios. Because privacy still exists. Because treatment is not a performance. But again, logic doesn't calm fear. Emotion does. And emotion was already on edge. Inside emergency response, there's also something called the observation window. Doctors don't just look for what's wrong now. They look for what could go wrong later. That means holding back on definitive statements. Which means headlines stay vague. Which means speculation fills the gap. Now let's address a critical contradiction. If emergency response teams believed his injuries were immediately life-threatening, the visible response would have looked very different. Rapid airway management. Aggressive intervention. Clear urgency. That wasn't visible. But absence of visible urgency does not mean absence of concern. It means controlled concern. And controlled concern looks boring. That's the problem. This story didn't feel boring enough for what people expected. So people assumed something was missing. They didn't see doctors running, so they imagined doctors whispering. They didn't see panic, so they imagined concealment. This is where misunderstanding of emergency culture creates distrust. Professionals don't dramatize. They compartmentalize. And compartmentalization reads as cold, especially when lives have already been lost. Now consider communication. Emergency teams communicate internally with precision. Externally, they communicate minimally. Why? Because early information is often wrong. Initial assessments change. Scans reveal new details. Symptoms evolve. Releasing partial information risks retraction later. And retractions damage trust. So professionals wait until they know more. But waiting fuels rumor. So no matter what they do, they lose. If they speak early, they risk being wrong. If they speak later, they're accused of hiding. That's the impossible bind. Inside the hospital, medical staff faced another layer. Public expectation. They weren't just treating a patient. They were treating a story already written in the public imagination. A story that said, worse than thought. A story that said he won't survive. Any update that didn't match that story would be rejected by some. So updates became cautious. Language became conservative. And conservative language sounds evasive to a fearful audience. Now ask yourself this. If emergency teams had rushed out to deny the quote immediately, what would have happened? The quote would have been legitimized. Headlines would repeat it again. Attention would intensify. Sometimes the best response to a rumor is to starve it. But starving a rumor takes time. And time was the one thing this story didn't have. Because while emergency response unfolded methodically, the internet demanded immediacy. And immediacy doesn't coexist with medicine. As this chapter comes to a close, one thing becomes clear. There is a fundamental mismatch between how emergencies are handled and how they are consumed. One values patience. The other punishes it. One values uncertainty. The other demands certainty. And caught in the middle was a man recovering from trauma, surrounded by professionals doing exactly what they're trained to do. But outside those walls, belief was already hardening. Because the longer emergency response stayed quiet, the louder speculation became. And that speculation was about to collide with something new. Not a quote, not a clip, but a response from someone people weren't expecting to hear from. A voice that would shift attention away from medicine and towards silence. What scares people more than bad news? No news. Because silence doesn't just leave space. It invites imagination to move in, rearrange the furniture, and start telling stories of its own. And after the emergency response faded into hospital walls, silence took over. Not dramatic silence. Not intentional silence. The kind of silence that exists when people are trying to figure out what to say without making things worse. Anthony Joshua's family didn't rush to social media. His team didn't issue emotional